Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our roundtable discussion on the future of energy. It is a great pleasure to have you here tonight. My name is Dóra Csernus. I am the lead climate and environmental policy expert of Equilibrium Institute. Let me tell you just a few words about our institute. Equilibrium Institute is an independent, future-oriented think tank. Our mission is to help create a smart and environmentally cleaner nation that is rooted in a strong community. To this end, we write policy proposals in the fields that we think are important for Hungary to become a better place by 2030. By organizing discussions like the discussion we have today, we wish to build bridges between experts and cultural decision makers, economic decision makers, and political decision makers. But what are the important topics if we speak about the welfare and the well-being of a country? Obviously, education, health, employment, democracy, and of course, sustainability are definitely among the most important topics. In the past 2 years, we have drafted 2 policy proposals on air pollution control and 3 policy proposals on climate change, related to climate change and climate policies. And now we are working on our policy proposal related to the Hungarian energy system of the not so far away future. It is in the framework of this project that we organized today's discussion, and we would like to thank the US Embassy for its support. So today's event is also focused on a very important topic. In Hungary nowadays, we use very often the expression energy trilemma. How to have secure, sustainable, and affordable energy. We will hopefully have the chance to touch upon all 3 parts of this so-called trilemma. Let me introduce our honorable guest speakers who will help us navigate this complex issue. So Ms. Olga Khakova, Deputy Director for European Energy Security at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for traveling to Hungary. Ms. Ürge-Vorsatz, who is Vice Chair of Working Group 3 at the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Professor at Central European University. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And last but not least, Mr. György András Deák, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Defense Studies at the National University of Public Service. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. So we will start with our keynote speech. So, Ms. Khakova, the floor is yours.
I want to make sure this is working. This is my first test, right? Making sure the mic is working. Okay. Good evening, everyone. And first of all, I just want to thank you, Dóra and Tamás, who is unfortunately not here, but I've had a pleasure of meeting other colleagues from the Equilibrium Institute. And thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you for the invitation. This is such a timely discussion. It's an honor to be here and in the presence of this distinguished panel. And I looked at the invitee list tonight. I mean, the expertise that's in the room is incredible, and I'm very much mostly looking forward to the discussion with you towards the end, to be honest. You mentioned the trilemma. You know, I think that's a good place to start. If we were to quickly reflect upon the last year and Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, and of course then following the weaponization of its energy exports to Europe, I mean, that has truly changed the conversation around energy security, energy transition, and the nexus of finding that sweet spot between affordability, security, and climate targets. A couple of lessons that were learned last year, the importance of valuing nationally produced, locally produced energy sources, right? Whether it's clean energy or other sources, and the importance of being able to implement that as quickly as possible. But overall, Europe is still going to be a major energy importer for a while, right? So to be realistic, how do you balance that value of bringing in as many clean energy sources locally, nationally, as possible, as quickly as possible, at the same time taking a look at what you do have to import, but making sure that those imports are coming from more diversified supplier pool and are coming through diversified routes, where you're not just relying on, one or a couple of major electricity arteries or one or two natural gas pipelines. So I think that those are some of the biggest lessons learned from last year is diversification. So not just the different energy sources, right? Making sure that it's not just heavily reliant on just natural gas, just oil, just nuclear, just solar, just hydro, the value of diversification, and using that as almost as an insurance policy, because when something is not working, whether for geopolitical reasons or there's a supply shortage, you can turn to something else, but also building out those relationships. And I think that's where our conversation will focus on today, is kind of why is there a role for transatlantic opportunity? When we're talking about local energy policies, like where can we actually work together? Where is that transatlantic piece, right? And that's why I want to dive into it a little bit. So first of all, I think last year emphasized the importance of energy efficiency. On both sides of the Atlantic, we are extremely inefficient economies. And I think always starting with efficiencies of how do you produce energy to how it's transmitted to how it is utilized at homes or in businesses and industries. That is such a tremendous opportunity to cut waste. Now, that's something that's this local. What is the role of US, EU, and then different national cooperation, or even cities cooperation? So a couple of different areas there. Supply chain efficiency actually has a pretty robust supply chain. For example, heat pumps. There are chip components to it, critical mineral supply chain. So making sure that all of that is available in order to be able to implement these efficiency solutions. And that's just one technology. Labor and training. Energy efficiency is very much a hands-on kind of implemented, developed, applied solutions, right? You need to have someone come in and do an assessment of your home to see where the heat or the cold is coming out before you can, whether you're insulating or whether you're looking at other opportunities to make your home. And that's just one example. Industries and other areas on improving efficiencies are huge opportunities as well. So labor, trainings, best practices there. I just came back from an event in Croatia that was organized by the Department of Energy, this new cities cooperation between US cities, US DOE labs, and cities across Europe. And it was fantastic to kind of learn about the really, really cool stuff that's happening in the labs in US. And sometimes it feels like it's the best kept secret, not intentionally, but because they're so busy developing these new exciting technologies that they're too busy to go in and say, hey, let's figure out how we can exchange best practices on implementing them. So that's another area. And we literally talked about that during the event in Split, Croatia. How do you exchange? And it goes both ways, not just from not just from US to, but Europe has some incredible, amazing expertise on some of these energy efficiency solutions. So exchanging best practices there. That's just one example. Building out the supply chains. So when you do have a policy that says, we want this many heat pumps implemented this year, those heat pumps have to be produced somewhere. They have to come from somewhere. Someone has to install them. So thinking through all of the steps there. So that's just on the energy efficiency. I mean, just to zoom out a little bit, even just thinking through the natural gas supply chain, the companies have gone above and beyond in terms of how efficient their operations are above the regulatory environment. But does that mean that it's sufficient enough and that it's good enough? Absolutely not. There's still tremendous amount of methane leakage all across the supply chain. So it's kind of that balance of the work that has been done is great. They've done an amazing work to capture tons and tons of these methane emissions, but it's nowhere near what it could be, right? So looking into ways that we can cooperate together, and then there's different levels, right? There's so many methane emission tracking organizations out there. It's almost overwhelming, and it's a great thing. But there isn't one major, global, here's how we track methane, and this is the best standard. Here's how we do it. And here are some best practices on when you have this type of leak. Here's how we address it. And, let's compare the numbers there. So, thinking ahead, as EU looks into implementing the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms towards all of the imports coming into the different European countries, that's going to be really, really important. So that becomes a very relevant conversation. So that's just another quick example. So I want to talk about nuclear next. Hungary has tremendous nuclear expertise with the existing power plant, with the expansion coming in, but I do want to talk about the importance of partnering with not just one supplier. Now, the elephant in the room is Russia, so the second, the expansion, the second plant that's being built is happening with Russia. And even outside of the kind of overall ethics of right now doing business with Russia, with what's going on with what they're doing in Ukraine, even just from a pure business decision, nuclear partnerships are 100-year-old partnerships, right? So they don't just, turn on and turn off in 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, like some of, like compared to like wind or solar projects that are maybe half or even less than that. There's this whole progress of building out the plant and then all of the decommissioning that happens afterwards. So why not build out that strong, that tight, that 100-year-old partnership? And I'm not saying, sure, U.S. is there, but I'm not saying it needs to be U.S., but maybe another country, just to kind of give yourself some options. So that's all I'll say on nuclear. And I think the SMRs, like the newer technologies, are so exciting. And we're seeing multiple agreements happening, discussions, different levels happening across Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, Romania, Poland, Slovenia. A lot of these countries are exploring Czech Republic, what these partnerships could look like. So once again, there's that geopolitical value of who do you want to be your partner going in, and who can you trust, right? And also the unknown variable, of course, are potential sanctions on Russian nuclear fuel. Could that be included this year? Who knows? We don't know if that's a possibility. How likely? How that would be implemented? And which countries may or may not get exemptions, because sometimes that happens too. When you have sanctions, you want to make sure that there's security of supply. So all of these components to kind of consider. And of course, there is no security, there is no energy transition without a huge nuclear component. And I'm preaching to the choir here, so Hungary is a perfect example of really deploying nuclear energy. So I think my one point there is, how do you then take that nuclear expertise and explore that with potentially other partners as well. One last thing that I'll mention on kind of the renewable deployment, going back to my earlier comments of last year, really emphasized the importance of developing clean, homegrown, renewable energy in the countries as much as possible. Of course, there's limitations to how much you can do. I would say last year in Europe, solar and batteries have been the bigger winners. Wind, we didn't see that grow as much as you would have thought. And now for a couple of different reasons. So the cost of the projects, of course, with the energy crisis, cost of the materials, there's been some uncertainty that some companies have kind of wanted to see more of what the different emergency tax, windfall tax situation, how that will develop. Some of the other regulatory uncertainties. So we've seen some companies kind of pull back and say, okay, we're ready to invest, but we want to see some more regulatory certainty first. So, but still, tremendous opportunity. And of course, for Hungary too, that's a perfect example of huge solar development, huge battery development. I was speaking with a couple of participants here early tonight about just kind of the importance of when you are building these plants and building that production, that diversification, keeping kind of balancing that environmental assessment, that grassroots outreach with the need to produce this new clean energy supply chain and be a part of that clean energy supply chain, at the same time engaging the communities, but doing it in an accelerated way without compromising the integrity of the process. And that's a tough thing to do, right? So for example, if you have we have a stack of bureaucratic papers, projects, and you're saying, look, we're in the energy crisis, we're gonna pull this one and bring this to the top and deal with this at the top. That's what I mean when I say accelerating, not, let's just ignore all the rules and laws and water quality, assess in other environmental assessments. So these are just kind of a couple of areas where I think we've seen some growth, this year is going to be different. Last year, a lot of the natural gas was able to be pulled from Chinese supplies because of COVID, as Chinese economies slowly comes back online. There is no guarantee that that natural gas supply that was offered to Europe last year will be there again. So just kind of thinking through the immediate energy shortages to anticipate in the winter. But Europe is coming out with record high storage levels. So that's a huge, huge win. But at the same time, if you look at the cost of that win and and the billions that were spent last year to achieve that win, to secure those supplies, and the impact that it had on the industry, it came at a big cost. So kind of thinking through and trying to be proactive, how do you get ahead of that this winter so it doesn't come by surprise? And how do you ensure that these efficiency measures are done right versus just killing demand, versus just asking industry to scale down? And being more proactive about how the energy is used to where you can still maintain the quality of life, the industrial production, the economic development, without while still using less energy. So, I mean, there's so much to cover. I could talk all night, but I want to make sure that I leave the other panelists with plenty of time, and then I know we have additional time for questions and a discussion towards the end. So.
Thank you very much. So we have now some insights about how the future of energy policy could develop in Europe and in Hungary, and what linkages could be made between the US and Hungary, or the region and the US. And in the next presentation, we will more focus on how this can be made while we parallelly protect the climate and concentrate on energy efficiency and use less fossil fuels. So Ms. Ürge-Vorsatz will talk about how energy transition could be done in a way that is decreasing both fossil fuel dependency and greenhouse gas emissions. Just one thing, we must not forget that the EU set the objective to become climate neutral by 2050. We also call this net zero target. For those in the room who are not experts of the topic, this means that by 2050, the greenhouse gases we emit, we also have to offset them with natural solutions like forests, or artificial solutions like carbon capture and storage. So, Ms. Ürge-Vorsatz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So yes, let me talk about the solutions that solve all the three parts of the energy trilemma, and in which we have lots of fantastic history of collaboration with the US, or at least not necessarily collaboration, but definitely many of the examples have been working best already from the United States, or that's where we have been learning from. So yes, that's also already started with one of the problems from the US, why energy, there are many facets of energy security. One facet is that simply climate change is already threatening our energy supply, and we have to think about that. We are extremely vulnerable to electricity, and we are going to be even more with the recent extreme climate events. And this is, of course, from Europe. We want to avoid this. We don't want to have to be cold. We don't want to have unaffordable energy. And so our answer in Europe was this. So partially to go back to coal, but also to procure other fossil fuels from other locations, and as a result we started to panickingly develop a lot of other new fossil infrastructure. Now I have to tell you that even though this looks really bad, actually this is much less bad than what we are doing when we are developing new natural gas infrastructure. And let me argue why from the climate perspective. So I know I am introducing different perspectives than from my colleagues, and we will have very different, perhaps different insights, but from a climate perspective, this is really weird. Why? In coal, we are only usually just reopening old coal mines whom we wanted to phase out. So just a few more years of more coal is actually not, we don't even see very much what we estimate in European emissions. It's not going to be more than 1% higher emission altogether, what we have done doing with coal. Nevertheless, what we are doing with new infrastructure, natural gas, this is the big problem. And this is from the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. Stranded assets are a huge problem. We just for keeping 2 degrees, and we are still aiming for much lower than 2 degrees. Just for 2 degrees, the assessment report says that we already have $12 trillion in current assets that will need to be stranded. That means that at least 30% of oil, 50% of gas, 80% of coal reserves have to remain unburnable. But that's not even the issue. The issue is that our power plants need to retire about 23 or 70 years earlier than expected lifetimes. But it's important to understand the stranded assets are not only power plants and gas pipelines and LNG terminals, but airplanes. What we are we're celebrating that the last jumbo went out and so on and so on. But in anything that combustion works with combustion engines, urban infrastructures which are adopted to sprawl. This is all wording from the IPCC, so UN accepted language. The most important is really the huge amount of stranded assets. Already 12 trillion. Now building new infrastructure. Any new infrastructure will be on fossil fuels means more stranded asset. And why is it a problem? Nobody wants, we just say, oh, well, they made enough money. No, any company that goes bust, any company that is not able to return their investment is a problem for the whole economy. It creates risk for financial market stability, it affects macroeconomic stability, and the problem is with stranded asset, this means the loss is already guaranteed. Either we lose the climate goals or we have tremendous losses in the economy. None of it is going to be good. So really what we want to avoid is to put any more investment in fossil fuel-related infrastructure, because if you put that, it will have to be used. In order to return investment, it will have to use for decades. So what's the solution? And this is the first of the solution. And this is a banana crop, 77th banana crop from the home of Amory Lovins, who was one of the big thinkers in the US, who basically has started the whole energy efficiency movement. And I'm so glad that Olga's first word was also about energy efficiency. And this house this has no heating. And you say, oh, yeah, okay, in Kenya, you don't need any heating, right? But this actually happens to be in the Rocky Mountains at 2,000 meters elevation. He doesn't have any heating system. He still has this an extremely comfortable house. So this was the dawn of the passive house concept. By now, this is a whole industry. It's very popular, but it's not still widespread enough. The reason I love this picture, because snow outside, no heating inside. It doesn't mean you cannot have heating, but you don't want. Most of the time you don't need heating, and still a very comfortable position. Now, we don't have to, but this is now, it has got very popular in the US as well. This is a beautiful passive house is a multi-generational house from New York State, but also we don't have to go to the US. This is in the 13th district. This is social housing for the poor. So this is where you really isolate people from the cost of living crisis and energy market volatilities, because even if you increase energy prices by tenfold, this is not going to affect them very much, because from a few thousand forints per year, even a few 10,000, although it's higher, but it's still not a major crisis, even for the more poor, for heating bills. So it comes no wonder that even the IPCC's 6th assessment report to mitigation, which is, covers from nuclear power to geoengineering to CCS, everything. The cover page is not about a big scale. It's about a net zero energy building, and it's social housing. It's very cheap, very affordable housing, and it also suggests that actually quality of life can even very substantially improve with such solutions. So yes, the built environment is crucial for a net zero future, especially because I'm glad you mentioned offsets, but there is increasing concern, and the scientific community is very alarmed that we simply don't have enough capacity to offset all our emissions. There is no way. We have and that we cannot avoid offsetting some emissions. So we really have to leave the offsets for a few areas which are not possible. For example, flying to avoid emissions. So let's try to go net zero in all other places. And And the problem is that in the developed countries like US and Europe, we have all the building infrastructure. So it's not about new buildings. So this is a wonderful retrofit in Brooklyn of a historic building. It shows that you can have absolutely high comfort levels and keep the monument levels, respect the national monument levels with still but achieve very high levels of energy efficiency. These are also examples from New York City. Now, the reason why we are jumping now to Vienna is to show that what is the trick to net zero. And this is, although it's a building, well, actually it happens to be a power plant by now, because I think it's the power plant of the 21st century. It's producing more energy than it consumes. But what is the trick to net zero? And again, I'm so glad that Olga, you also mentioned energy efficiency as the first. The trick to net zero is the following, and I'll show you what. This is actually shows one of the big scientific mistakes of my life, because we published a lot about net zero energy building and say, yeah, there are building types where you can never achieve net zero. And for sure, high-rise commercial buildings in not very sunny countries like ours, no way, forget it. Now, fortunately, there are some smart people who don't read my scientific literature, but do it. They don't just talk about it, but they actually do it. So these people have done the following. Well, before I got in how they have done it, just let me justify a little bit. I wasn't that stupid to say that, because in Vienna, the average energy consumption of a commercial building is about 800 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. Even a very modern new office building is 450. And all you can produce now the technology is a bit better, but still it was about 60 kilowatt hours per square meter per year by solar energy. So clearly this cannot, right? 60 cannot be bigger than 450. I wasn't that stupid. Now, fortunately, again, there are some innovative people who don't look at, what the science says, but want to actually do it. So this is the 458. This is already the very high efficient new office building and the energy consumption of that. And I don't want to go to the detail, don't worry about it. All the kinds of things that we need electricity for, from the security system to elevators to kitchen equipment. So this is what they have done. And this is the key to our net zero future. Not only in buildings, everywhere. They have optimized 9,300 components. And because of this optimization, they managed to decrease the energy consumption by 9/10. Even the professors of the electrical engineering department, I just was in Japan with Naki, who is really one of the biggest names in the energy field. He's a professor from the TU Vienna. He had no idea that this happened, because it's so comfortable, you don't realize it's more comfortable. You don't realize that. And it's not about rocket science. It's just a lot of optimization. Actually, it was students who just went around and was thinking, yeah, true, the security system, actually, why is it consuming so much? Because nobody cares how much a security system takes in terms of energy. So if you look at this, and this is my point, that everywhere to going net zero carbon is the trick to first really reduce demand. And I was so happy. I was telling Dóra that, I would so much love to talk about why I was in Japan, invited by the Japanese government, and I didn't know how. But this is how. Because the Japanese government is also playing very high emphasis now on the demand-led transformation. They also realize it's difficult to realize the energy trilemma without putting a lot more emphasis on demand. So this is the outcome with 56. 56 is smaller than 60, so this has become a net zero, an energy plus building, meaning producing more energy than consuming. Now, this is our recent research. If you do nothing else, but simply at every retrofit, you employ this technology, and by the way, the costs were less than a regular retrofit. The costs were less than a regular retrofit, because you didn't need to have huge building heating system reconstruction. You basically need no heating in such an office building, virtually absolutely no heating, because you have so much internal heat gains. You just have to be really smart with how you use that. So if you just replicate these already existing best practices from the US, from the West, then we can totally get rid of natural gas import dependence in Europe, in all of our countries. Some countries a bit later than than others. Of course, how soon, it really depends on us, how much we emphasize this as a solution. So the point is we wouldn't need any replacement, but we do need very high efficiency buildings. And actually it was also from the US when we understood that the cost shouldn't be prohibited. This is from our paper on summarizing all the different examples of net zero building stock. And what this shows is actually from Philadelphia, same neighborhood, both passive houses and conventional buildings, very similar buildings. It shows that actually average cost of a passive house was smaller than the average conventional, and this was already over a decade ago, so by today the costs are actually much better. So from here I want to go to the other pillar of, because we still need to, even in a passive house, even if you decrease your energy by 9/10, you still need some remaining energy. What I want to argue with is actually, I don't know if you remember the opening slide from Egyens, we needed that in the background. There is this huge solar farm. And actually also my inspiration for the research that I'm going to show now was when I also was traveling in Japan, and I saw these huge solar farms. Also from the plane, you see them, and I said, you have so little land. You just cannot cover, your energy from using so much land. So we started, and now we have the most comprehensive and most detailed building integrated solar energy generation model of the world, and this is the paper where we produced it. We showed in that in the whole world, if we do nothing else, just utilize the existing roofs, just insulated roofs, we can produce more electricity than the entire global current electricity demand, not for buildings, all electricity. We can produce more electricity just on roofs. We don't need any land, anything. For Hungary, the same applies. We can produce more electricity in Hungary than what the current total electricity demand is this. So we can produce 20 to 30% more electricity just on roofs. Of course, there are issues with timing and location, but you would be surprised, or probably many of you heard, that actually when do you think Hungary produced the most solar electricity recently? I think it was February, no? It was not in July, not in June when we had the most sun. It was in February. So that shows that we are really underestimating the potential for this. So just to conclude, how can net zero energy, not zero carbon, net zero energy buildings and building integrated photovoltaics bring us to very high levels of energy security? So let's just summarize that. So half of all final energy is actually, we always talk only about the fuels, how we produce the energy. We never ask, okay, but what is that energy used for? Actually, half of all European energy, final energy, is for heat. And Hungary is is the highest in the whole European Union in terms of the share of the final energy going for heat. So the answer is not where we can get more energy to produce something for which we don't need energy, but to implement that we shouldn't need energy for that, for which we don't need energy. So we can eliminate all of non-EU natural gas dependence, and what that means, we can leave the existing EU natural gas sources for the important areas where we do need natural gas for, and other, and also if you since 70% of electricity today produced is used in buildings. Now, if buildings produce mostly their own electricity, you can leave all the present electricity capacities for all the other electrification needs that we need, transportation, industry, and in a lot of areas we need to be electrified. Even agriculture, if we do hydrogen and other fuels, then we need a lot more clean electricity. So with very low energy bills, which is through passive houses, and self-production, meaning we produce the power basically where you need the power, you isolate both residents and businesses and countries from energy market disruptions, price volatilities, cost of living crises, inflation. Basically, if you don't have to pay for something, then it really doesn't matter how much inflation is. So also, what the slide that I showed with, this is my concluding slide. So the slide that I started with, passive houses are much more resilient to to power outages. And in fact, and this is where another very important collaboration opportunity with the US is policy examples. There are a lot of excellent policy best practices in the US. For example, New York City actually mandated a building energy efficiency policy, not because of climate, not because of energy security, but after Sandy. Because the only buildings that still worked 2-3 days after the hurricane was actually the passive houses, because they don't require a lot of energy input. You can still function in them. You keep in a cold spell, you still keep residents hot, so warm, so they don't need to go into their cars and try to heat themselves, which was now a problem with this cold spell. In a hot spell without power, which can often happen because with the heat waves, we may not be able to power all the AC needs. Actually, they keep you much longer cool. So anyway, this is security, the multifaceted aspects of security and resilience and safety. And also locally produced power is more resilient to power system disruptions, political conflicts, local both in terms of nationally produced, but also we produce it where we actually need it. So So whereas all energy generation in large scale results in geopolitical dependencies, and I'm sure we will talk about that as well, that yes, we may be getting out of fossil dependencies, but there is more and more discussion that we are getting into new dependencies for the rare earth minerals, from different metals, and that will totally redraw the geopolitical map of the whole world. But still, nevertheless, if you don't have to produce very much, then you are actually isolating also yourself from the new dependencies. So finally, with very low demand on the grid from buildings, as I said, 70% is of power today used in buildings. So basically, you can free up the existing production capacities for electrification, other sectors. And I know so far, I mean, you're typically still written off with as the nice, green tree hugger agenda. But I was so glad that again I'm coming back from Japan last night, where the Japanese government invited us, and their key agenda is the DX. They had the GX, that's the energy transformation, energy transition revolution, and the DX is the demand-led energy transformation revolution. So they are really realizing that we cannot do all of this change without a very strong focus on the demand side. So thank you very much for your attention. These are just further examples from the US. Here showing also how repurposing and how also social goals can really be, and affordability can really be solved through together with the environmental goals. So, but I'll keep these for the discussion. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, actually, I wanted to stress how important it was, what you just said, but you said it so many times that it's just, but I'm just, we cannot stress it enough that the only purpose is not to replace the amount of energy that we are using now with other types of energy and other geographic sources of energy. We just have to use less energy and diversify the energy that we produce. So the last presentation will be by András Deák, who will hopefully link geopolitics to energy transition and put some light on the future of this topic. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dóra. I have a bit of advantage because with my humble fantasy, I could not imagine this panel. And I requested a bit of help from Dóra. She sent me questions. And implicitly, my slides are as answers to those questions, what has been asked. So when we come to the history, I won't speak about future. I'm going to speak about past and present. When we go back to the beginning of the last century, Europe was supplied, European oil was supplied, both from Russia and the US. And it was a normal competition. Basically, as you may see, only two major suppliers of oil were present on the globe. And then what happened were two revolutions in Russia. and the Soviet nationalization of the energy industry, and Russia disappeared from the European energy markets for 50 years. So what really matters in the European energy landscape is, of course, resource availability, which is at the moment today is present both on the Russian side and also on the US side, on the global energy markets. And what also matters is political or geopolitical acceptability. And this is always a constraint for Russia. And what we see today, that Russia, at least partially, is excluded from the old continent, is not a new phenomenon. This already happened roughly 100 years ago. So just wanted to say that this is not absolutely new, what we see today. So another question was sent by Dóra, whether we can get rid of Russian gas by the end of the decade. Actually, we are almost there. So as you may see, the red line is the gas from the east. This means Russian gas. We are very happy that they haven't closed all the supplies, so it really definitely helps. But as you may know, we can cope with the situation with so little Russian gas at the moment, as it looks now. So actually, you don't have to wait until 2030 if you want to get rid of Russian gas. Very much looks like that if there's a must, we can say goodbye to it. So the questions we have to ask, whether we or the Russians would like to keep this situation as the new normality. Yes, I think if Europe is asked, there is a good deal of irreversibility of the situation. So Russia will never be again the base supplier of natural gas for the old continent. They can remain a swing supplier if they want. But so much political and business trust has been lost in the last 1 year that this is gone. And as the war goes on, Europe will have to turn to other suppliers. Long-term contracts will have to be concluded. So it will be more and more difficult for the Russians to come back. Well, whether the Russians would like to come back, that's a good question. I don't know. They have a new capacity constraint. So as you may know, the biggest pipeline, the Nord Stream, is not there anymore. I don't know whether it is going to be manned at any time. I don't think that Poland will let Russian gas flow through its territory again, ever. Maybe the Commission can force them that, but I have serious doubts. So they have a capacity constraint. What they have is the Turk Stream and Ukraine. And of course, the question is whether it is in their interest, whether political or business interest to come back. Still, they have the whole infrastructure there in Western Siberia, so they can turn it back at any moment in one day and send more gas to the continent. Well, we will see. So I think the situation is sustainable in the medium run. So in this decade, so to go on with little or no Russian gas. And what is the financial and policy price to pay? I think that, yes, there will be some. So, and maybe I have another slide here. So, of course, the political advantage of not being dependent on one supplier is huge. And there was a price to pay in terms of politics, that we were so much dependent on Gazprom. But on the other hand, we sometimes forget that this was not a one-way street. So Europe was basically a monopoly for Western Siberian Russian gas. and we could enforce things that we cannot enforce to any other against the Gazprom. So when we, but as you may know, when the Commission tried to start negotiations with Qatargas on European supplies, the Qatarians said, sorry boys, we don't care the DG competition. So forget about European competition law. There will be no unified European price, which was enforced against the Gazprom in many ways. So we are entering a diversified market. That's great, but there is a policy price to pay, and we will also have to compete for the LNG with the Asian suppliers. We did not have to that much compete for the Russian gas. Every second incremental cubic meters of gas in the second half of the 2000s, when we had a huge import growth on the European continent, came from the Russians. And it kept European gas prices relatively low. So I'm saying that it has a price, it has a policy price, it has a economic price, and we have a major political advantage of pushing back the Russians to a swing supplier status. Well, if it comes to the energy transition, we have to ask the question whether natural gas will be needed. Yes, Diana was right, so energy efficiency is a crucial thing, but if I stay realistic, I don't think that we can build passive houses all over the continent in one day, so tomorrow. So it is all the plans, what we had for energy transition relied on exiting coal as soon as possible and exiting coal faster than we can build up energy efficiency and renewables. So in this regard, we very much relied on natural gas. Definitely natural gas was the last fossil fuel to die, according to the plans. And here you see the German projection before the Fit for 55 plan. So this is for the 40% emission reduction. And you may see that the Germans didn't want to exit coal that fast in those years. And the natural gas consumption was only gradually to grow, was basically the most moderate decline among fossil fuels. What happened now is that they shall have a much faster coal exit. Actually, coal, even if there is a political pledge, will have to be decommissioned by the end of this decade. And this assumes a much larger natural gas consumption. So natural gas will be needed at least in this decade and even the 30s in relatively large quantities. We cannot decrease the consumption of natural gas so fast. So the problem is that we don't have an alternate plan. So this is the plan. This was the plan that, okay, get rid of the fossil fuels and use natural gas as much as we can. Of course, use a lot of energy efficiency, but all what we save in the heating sector in terms of natural gas, we put into the electricity generation. And the assumption behind was that natural gas is going to be cheap. So we had in the second half of the 2010s, 20 euro per megawatt hours, which is a relatively cheap natural gas price, especially in terms of production costs. Well, as you may know, at the moment, I don't see we have an equilibrium today in Europe, but we have 50, and we will see whether the balance price will looks. So what we should basically have a new plan when there will be an expensive gas, high carbon price environment. And this is a little bit different than what we expected before the war. Well, I argue that expensive gas is not a carbon price. it has similar effects in some sectors, but in general it is not. First of all, because simply it is not laid on carbon. So it is laid only partially on carbon. What Diana reflected, that we came back to coal, was a very good example to that. Actually, natural gas, high natural gas against cheap coal is not a good climate policy. So it's not efficient as a carbon price. Expensive natural gas might be problematic in some segments, not enhancing adaptation and substitution. So again, of course, it provides a major boost in the heating sector for energy efficiency investments, but in the electricity generation sector, it has its setbacks. So it keeps coal alive for a while. This is not a good policy, a very expensive policy. And well, it is a much more volatile. So when you introduce carbon pricing, you know that the carbon price will gradually grow as the emission cap comes down and down. You don't have this kind of certainty using natural gas because it is a market price. It is a very volatile market price. So of course, yes, I can say that for high natural gas prices, it has a lot of benefits. You don't have to say so many subsidies for insulation in the heating sector. It gives a boost for renewable related solutions or renewable. On the other hand, it also challenges social support earlier than expected. So it's a major problem that you have expensive carbon and expensive natural gas. This is a much bigger burden for the population, and this can challenge the social support for climate change. At the same time, of course, also high natural gas prices make the coal exit more painful because you have to introduce natural gas instead of coal. And this is going to raise the cost of the whole energy transition. So basically, my message is that we cannot really redesign our energy transition policy because of the new situation, but higher natural gas prices will definitely challenge the political context. What we are thinking about, how we try to manage the energy transition. It is going to be much more to be felt by the population. The good news that, of course, the blame will not come from only for the climate policy. So high natural gas prices, of course, a lot of things can be blamed. It is market what is going to be blamed for, unlike blaming politically driven carbon prices. So a lot of things can be done without referring the green transition, saying simply we have to do this because this is the new market reality on the continent. So I think it is a very mixed situation. We have to think about much more challenging times will come ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, we received a good quantity of food for thought tonight that we can talk about later in the future. And if I want maybe to just take out two keywords, which is extremely difficult after these presentations, we have to replan what we think about energy security and sustainability, and the two keywords would be energy efficiency and diversification. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for being here.